Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the 6th lecture in the U of R's 2021 Research with Impact series. I'm Dr. Trish Elliott, Professor of Investigative and Community Journalism at First Nations University of Canada. And over the next hour, you're going to hear from Dr. Cindy Hanson, a dear friend of mine and a professor of Sociology and Social Studies at the U of R, and president of the Canadian Association for the Study of Adult Education. Before I officially introduce Dr. Hanson, I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are gathered virtually on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the ancestral lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis, on whose territories the University of Regina resides. And I would like to add a personal acknowledgement of the harmful impacts of colonialism on Indigenous people and the deep sorrow felt across the nations, across all nations, with the discovery of unmarked graves. And it is a time for great reflection and also action. The U of R's alumni department, together with the Lifelong Learning Center, is pleased to offer the Research with Impact series virtually. Since the previous sessions were so well received, the Alumni Department and the Lifelong Learning Center has decided to continue the series throughout the fall. And so keep an eye on the alumni website for details of upcoming lectures from Dr. Elizabeth Cooper on October 19th and the U of R President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Jeff Cashane, on November 16th. And Jeff, I think, is putting something in the chat with a link. Thank you, Jeff. I'm really excited to hear from Dr. Hanson today, and I hope that your time with us inspires you to come back for future sessions this fall. And I'd like to point out that these sessions are being recorded and will be posted on the alumni website so that you can watch the presentations again or share them with others. You'll see a link to that website in the chat, as I said, if you want to access the video later. And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce our 6th speaker in the series, Dr. Cindy Hanson. As I mentioned, Dr. Hanson is a professor of Sociology and Social Studies at the U of R and president of the Canadian Association for the Study of Adult Education. Her research and teaching illustrates participatory and community-based approaches to themes around gender, social justice, and Indigenous-settler relations. She is the principal investigator of 2 SSHRC-funded studies. Number 1, Reconciling Perspectives and Building Public Memory, Learning from the Independent Assessment Process, which explores the Indian residential school settlements compensations for abuse. And on the Knowledge Synthesis Grant, Here Today, Gone Tomorrow, Public Transportation and Vulnerabilities in Rural and Remote Canada. So today, Dr. Hanson will be discussing what is potentially the largest claim concerning abuse of children in the world, the Independent Assessment Process, or IAP. The IAP was included in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement to compensate survivors of Indian residential schools for abuse suffered at those schools. And so this talk is going to explain the IAP, how it was constructed and understood through 3 genres: the news media, elected officials, and interviews with diverse stakeholders. So just a really interesting approach that I'm so looking forward to learning more about. Following Cindy's presentation, we've got about 15 minutes for a Q&A, and Herta from the Lifelong Learning Center will be moderating that. And as you listen to Dr. Hanson's presentation, please put your questions in the chat feature, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And that will be shared with Dr. Hanson shortly after her presentation ends. And you can start registering questions as you like anytime, but we'll hold them to the end, and we'll do our best to get to as many as time allows. And I know people have places to go at 1. I myself am teaching at 1, so we'll try to keep it within the 1 hour that we have. So I'm now going to turn the floor over to Cindy, and welcome, Cindy.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Trish. And I'd like to also acknowledge my presence on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 in Indigenous lands. My talk today is going to focus mainly on my research study. It's a SSHRC-funded study called Reconciling Perspectives and Building Public Memory, Learning from the Independent Assessment Process. Curtis, could you change the slide? I'll just, yeah, thanks. And this is a second study I have done on the topic of the independent assessment process. It's a national study now in its 4th year, and it includes Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers and collaborators, including the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, the Indigenous Peoples Health Research Center, and the Saskatchewan Aboriginal Women's Circle, among others. Next slide. The purpose of the study is to describe the insights of various stakeholders involved in the independent assessment process, or what's known more as the IAP. And I will give you more background on that shortly. To understand how the experiences and insights in this can inform settler-colonial relationships, hierarchies of knowledge of power, and politics of reconciliation. And finally, to look at how we can transfer this knowledge into the way we remember, or public memory. So let me just move to the next slide, which is came to me from an interview I did recently, where the interviewer said, "So why are you doing this work?" And I guess my knowledge, or my past experience around Indian residential schools started most specifically around 1993, when I was teaching Native Studies in Brandon. And in the lower left-hand side of this slide, you see an old school, and that's the Brandon Indian Residential School, or Industrial School, which has since been torn down. But we broke into, I was teaching Native Studies and broke into the school with my students, or entered the school. We did a video, an educational video about the school. And while we were standing there, one of the students who was acting as the moderator stood outside the school and said, "And this is where there are unmarked graves." And that was my first knowledge about unmarked graves, and it never left my mind. In fact, it continued through different stories. And on the right-hand side of this slide, you see the Musqueam School that still exists. And I visited that school in the late 90s, also with students while teaching that course, or the Indian residential schools. Further to that, my partner is an Indian residential school survivor and worked as an adjudicator and lawyer in the IAP. And thus that brought me into understanding more about what the Canadian government was doing, what was happening to survivors, etc. I met many survivors through my lifetime of work in Indigenous communities. And I felt that when the Indian residential school agreement came out, that it could be different than it was. And I started to think about how it is that we shape stories, and how do we shape our knowledge about Indian residential schools, and how does that knowledge also get changed when we hear other stories, or when the media constructs other forms of knowledge. So further, when I heard about the Supreme Court decision to destroy the records and testimonies of the IAP unless individual survivors decided otherwise, I knew that this study would be one of the last remaining stories about the IAP. Can I get you to change the slide? So that also triggered for me the TRC recommendation of a duty to remember. And that duty to remember is to acknowledge Canada's history of genocide and certainly assimilation in the creation of Indian residential schools and the abuse that happened within them. The IAP was part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, Most people are familiar with the TRC or common experience payments. Common experience payments were payments given to every living survivor of Indian residential schools who could confirm that they had attended a school and lost language and culture. The independent assessment process was different from that. The independent assessment process looked at serious physical and sexual abuse that happened in the schools, and then through a process offered some compensation to the survivor who came forward with a story in an out-of-court process about the abuse at the Indian residential school. Can you move to the next slide? Yeah, thank you, that's the one. So the IAP was large. It involved 38,000 living Indian residential school survivors applying for compensation for the abuses they suffered at Indian residential schools. From those 38,000 survivors, and let me just say that it's estimated by people like Paulette Reagan that there were about 150,000 Indian residential school survivors. By the time the IAP came about in the Indian residential school settlement, so around 2006, you have about 70,000 living survivors. And of this, over the next period of 14 years under which the IAP takes place, you have 26,000 hearings and 38,000 survivors, so more than 50% making claims for serious physical and sexual abuse. 90% of those are compensated, speaking to, I think, the extent of abuse at the Indian residential schools. And when we're talking about abuse, we are talking about serious physical abuse. So it's not a slap on the wrist, it's more extensive than that. The average claim is around $91,000. And if you look at the way the media constructed the story on the IAP, you will quickly see that, you know, there's often a mention that it costs $4 billion. We still have to analyze how that money was actually spent. But what we do know is that this is the largest class action suit in Canadian history and perhaps even in the world. So the IAP and settlement agreement ended on March 31st of this year. And the process involved a survivor, often with a support person or family, going to a hearing. It was meant to be non-adversarial, so it would often happen in a hotel room or something like that. And they'd go to a hearing, and there would be a rep from Canada at the table. There sometimes, but seldom, would be a rep from the church. Usually the rep from Canada represented both positions. There would be an adjudicator, which was like a judge, but who would have the power to ask the questions and make the decision as to whether or not the survivor's story could be credible, and the survivor would also be present to tell their story. All of these stories were transcribed, and transcriptions exist of the stories. In 2017, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the survivors' hearings were done under common law and should therefore be private, and only the survivor should have access to that story. And if they decide they want to get the testimony, they can make it available to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation up until 2027, at which time all of the records of the testimonies will be destroyed through that ruling. So these are the records of the most serious physical and sexual abuse at residential schools. So what we wanted to do was to do a critical discourse analysis of using in vivo of Hansard debates. So what were elected officials? What was happening in the House of Commons between 2006 and 2019 regarding the IAP? what was the media saying about this? So we looked at 19 years of media, or 14 years of media analysis, 12 years of Hansard analysis, and are just completing a process of interviews and focus groups, working with about 50 survivors, adjudicators, judges, Indigenous leaders, psychologists, lawyers, resolution health support workers, who were all involved in the IAP. The next slide, thank you. The type of analysis we're doing is called a discourse analysis. And a discourse analysis looks at the idea that we construct reality. Reality is socially constructed. So the way we talk about the world, the way we act in the world, helps to create the story of a particular subject. And in this case, the story we're looking at is how the IAP was constructed. So who were the actors? Who were the people involved? What were their roles? What did they say? How did they frame the IAP? And how will this record be handed on to future generations? So that becomes particularly important if other records don't exist. So what we found in the Hansard analysis, which we call the analysis of elected officials, was that there were very few references to it. So if you think about this in terms of 38,000 survivors, $4 billion, the IAP is mentioned 28 times specifically in the House of Commons debates and in the Hansard. And what is mentioned at the beginning, the green line here, is the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement is talked about a lot more than the IAP. The question then is, how does the IAP get constructed in public forums? So we looked at this, and what we see is that a lot of the findings suggest stories about power and colonial relations. So how we assume when we do a discourse analysis that we don't take a politically neutral position, but we realize that discursive practices can produce and illustrate unequal power relations between people and between subjects. So when we look at this in terms of Indigenous settler relations, we see that power is illustrated in different ways. So we ask, what is the narrative being told? Who are the primary actors and what are their roles? So what we find is that this is often in the House of Commons replicating a story that these are of the past, get over it, right? I'm sure you've all heard that. But the past the past constructs the present, and it remains how we understand the world around us. So we need to always contextualize what's happening, so not neglect it. So what the other thing that was important in this analysis is we realized that a lot of the discussion on the IAP was about political partisanship. So can you show the next slide there, Curtis? So in the political party discussions, liberals talked about, taking over the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement from the Tory government, bringing closure. They were going to fulfill the obligations. We were going to end this dark period in Canadian history. Somehow it was going to be over. Liberal discourse tended to focus on, the conservatives tended to focus on how they were going to now, through the settlement agreement, show their commitment to Indigenous issues and bring them to closure. Again, that idea that, it's somehow all going to be over with this. The NDP primarily, oh, I just forgot his name, Angus, talked about, you know, the IEP is not the end of the chapter, and the government is failing to uphold the spirit and intent of the IEP. And it was primarily only the words of, I wish I could think, somebody help me with his name, not, I'm thinking of a lawyer's name instead of
Charlie Angus.
Charlie Angus, thank you. So it's primarily Charlie Angus that is quoted about the IEP, and was one of the only people that talked about the issue being more than just a politically partisan issue, but that this is a structural issue, and that people also need to have access to records. So he was one of the few people that talked about that. Can I get the next slide, please? So when we looked at the media analysis, we wanted to look at how the media framed the IEP and framed the actors involved in the IEP. So when we're talking about the actors involved, you know, how it frames the survivors, the support workers, the lawyers, the adjudicators, etc. And what we found is the media really created sort of a common sense about residential schools belonging to Indigenous people. And, you know, now that all this money was being spent to resolve the claims, the past would no longer be an issue. So it's kind of a discourse on settlers as taxpayers, and that's been argued in some of the literature. Although some of the early quotes by ministers of education talked about the IEP as being reconciliatory and healing, that is not widely discussed by actors in the IEP, but not the Secretariat itself talks about 90% of claimants being compensated as a sign that the IEP was successful. So, you know, that language of investment is also an Indigenous settler kind of language, or shows that kind of relationship. When we looked at the media analysis, we wanted to also look at Indigenous media, national media, and a sampling of dailies, newspapers. So these last two slides show the sources of media that we looked at, and we looked at everything that was written about the IEP over 14 years in these sources. So what's interesting when you start to look at this is you find, for example, the APTN produces, you know, in most cases, more than twice as many articles in quantity as other sources of media about the IEP. But you know, it's not necessarily saying that all Indigenous media does that, because you look at Eagle Feather News and it's sort of in line with National Post. So then you have to look at, you know, qualitatively, what is it saying that, you know, may be different. Thanks. So then the things we looked at with inside that is, you know, what are the topics that are being discussed over 14 years? What are the topics being discussed in these different medias? And so, for example, you can see healing and reconciliation is discussed more than justice or ethics. Intergenerational trauma is not discussed that much, though it's considered very important by survivors. The outcomes of the IEP and the actual, you know, stories of what the IEP is about tend to occupy a lot of space. And part of it is because of the complexity of the IEP, but also because of actions of lawyers and corrupt lawyers, which occupy a lot of the discourse in the media. So when we're looking at how frequently the topics get discussed, we have to look at also who are the actors, who is framed in that discussion. So this slide quantifies who is being discussed, not how they are discussing issues. So for example, one of the actors discussed is Indigenous peoples. This is not just saying, how Indigenous people are discussed, but that they are being discussed. So that's a major topic within the media, or the courts are also one of the major topics, or the state itself, Canada, how Canada is understood. So interesting in this, the media itself is seldom critical of the media, or media is looking at how the media reports on it. Residential schools are not discussed very much. So those all become the actors, or who is discussed in the media. So we looked at and we continue to look at that. So the third part of our analysis is looking at interviews. And because this data is still very exploratory, and as we go through it, we're like, oh, we need to interview. So this tends to expand as we go along. We're still figuring out how to explore the story from the interviews. So I think that the second quote here is one that just continues to resonate with us, and why I, titled my talk, Whose Story to Tell. One of the most prominent lawyers in the IAP said to us, you have to tell the right story. And that's always an interesting thing coming from a lawyer. So that was tongue in cheek. So whose story is being told? How is the narrative constructed so that we hear a certain story? What is the story that we're hearing? Who is it told from? And what does this all mean? So I wanted to just provide a couple quotes here so you could get a sense of the kind of stories or narratives that we're working with. So the other problem is this happened to children, and they are working on memories that didn't have context at a time, like the reaction of a perpetrator. So, when the IEP happened, it was asking survivors to remember the stories of abuse that they had experienced, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, right? So the third quote here is, this is what's going to happen. This is how it's going to happen. And this is what we're going to compensate you for. It's your day, but you got to do it this way. So this was a survivor and a support worker talking about how hard it was for people to walk into that hearing and know that this was their day, and for many to tell a story of abuse that they had never told anybody in their life in some cases. And, to know that if they didn't tell it in a way that would meet certain levels or harms that were distinguished in the model, that they may in fact not get any kind of compensation. So the way the story was told also became really important. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. So the last quote here is, in understanding the work we do, going through all of that, there's also a lot of positive. We talk about a lot of that healing, some of them getting through it and using this as an opportunity to finally verbally state out loud and hear themselves share that personal story and tragedy and what they've gone through. So this particular quote speaks about the power of testimony, and how for some survivors, the experience was a healing experience, and for others, it was a re-traumatization. So, and I just want to say that our interviews are not looking at people's stories of abuse, but it's stories of working with the IEP model, or that the particular way that it was experienced. So where's all this taking us? We continue to do analysis on, how this is how we are constructing Indian residential schools, how the IAP will be remembered. When the talk about the graves in front of the schools, we know that some of those stories have been told during the IAP testimonies. We know that a lot of those stories will never be recovered. We also want to look at further analyzing, in particular, a couple things. One is public memory, and that is how a community or a collective builds a story and remembers that story. So how will the IAP be remembered, 50 years from now, etc. And the other one is on epistemic injustice. And epistemic injustice looks, particularly from Ficker's world or works, looks at the knower and what they know and the ethics of silencing or excluding someone's representation of that knowledge through testimony. So, and things like lack of trust, it's also looked at as epistemic violence. When someone's, for example, tells a story and the particular way in which they tell the story may not be understood, and so it might be excluded or silenced. I think, this is particularly resonates in terms of understanding how different people see the world and how language influences how we see and be in the world with that understanding. So we're also looking at different ways of mobilizing knowledge, and this is where we get into, public pedagogies or ways of working in the world that, can create people's understanding and knowledge and so on. Doing a talk like this becomes really important, but this is only reaching a certain, group of people. But how else can we reach people to let them know, that this happened, what it means, how we go forward knowing this, and what it means, for a process of reconciling perspectives or reconciliation. So two of the collaborators in the project have written a play. We're looking at podcasts, conferences, speakers, etc. And finally, I think what this study is also demonstrating is that there are a lot of gaps in understanding settlement agreements and how they get played out. And so the Indian Residential Settlement Agreement, the 60 Scoop Settlement Agreement, day schools, there's still a lot of work and a lot of research that needs to be done about these, and then how they relate to the whole finding of graves around the schools and the Indian residential schools are themselves. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave off. And I wanted to make sure that we had lots of time for questions. So I hope I've done okay on that. I have. Hope I didn't talk too fast. And I'm also would love to, if there's things people don't understand, to try and explain them in a way that might help.
Thank you so much, Cindy. That was really interesting. And I'd like to just ask, does anyone out there have questions? Please put them in the chat.
Could I just ask a quick question just out of my own interest? We know that I think, last time I talked to the executive director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, I think he said that 40% of Canadians knew about Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I just would like to have an idea how many people on this talk knew about the IAP. Like if you can just in some way raise your little blue hand or something, I don't know. It's under the reactions.
Carrie, I think we have a question in the chat. Yes, we have a couple of questions in the chat, and if anybody else has a question, feel free to add one. But the first question is from Kay, who asks Cindy, how did you get involved?
In the IEP?
Yes.
In researching about the IEP, yeah. So it was sort of like my, as I explained at the beginning, I had this interest that sort of from working with students on Indian residential school in the 90s, and that continued in terms of meeting survivors, but also because my partner was an intergenerational survivor and worked as an adjudicator and then a lawyer in IEP hearings. I was hearing, stories and recognizing the impact it was having. So, yeah. Okay. And I knew, sorry, I just also want to add, I also, when the 2017 decision came down by the Supreme Court about the destruction of records, I also recognized that if we don't know our history, we're deemed to repeat it. So I think it's really important that we have some kind of record of what went on with the IAP, with the hearings, with these stories. And so I recognize that many of them exist at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, the stories that were told during those public hearings. I think there's 6,000 records, but my concern was for the more serious stories that would probably not be saved.
Okay, and that's a good lead in for the next question. Can you speak more to what will happen to the testimony?
Yeah, so at present, people have, through our stories, our record, I believe is what it's called, survivors have until September 12, 2027 to make their personal records saved. And so in that way, what they can do is they can request their record, and then they can request that it be stored at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. I think this is really important, and I actually think it's a place where the government botched part of the process. And that's at the very beginning of the process. There wasn't a lot of discussion around the records, and probably should have been. So when survivors went into the hearings, they were told that these would be secret or they would be confidential. And so when survivors were told that, of course, years later, it wouldn't make sense that they would be told that, all these records would be shared. So it's also because the IEP was done through a class action lawsuit, and that's a whole nother matter, is, our legal decisions, the right kind of decisions for making or bringing about some kind of justice around abuses in Indian residential schools, or should we be looking at, other decisions? So these things are all really complicated. And initially I was, so just vehemently opposed to the destruction of records. And now I understand how it was told to survivors. It becomes even more complex. But I think, any policy that goes forward and has some kind of testimony giving process involved in it needs to look at how people can be educated about testimonies being stored, for example, 50 years and brought out later, or redacted, or, saved in a way that protects the identity, if desired, by the survivor. So the one other thing I want to say on this is that it's also that we've talked to several survivors who have said that they would like to make their testimony public. But again, there's a whole bureaucracy involved in doing this. And we're talking about, in many cases, the most marginalized in our communities, the most marginalized people. And so unless there's organizations or, some kind of body assisting people to do this, it's not going to happen. And right now we know that there are very few, like count them on two hands, testimonies that are being protected by the NCTR.
Okay. A question, can you speak more to what will happen to the testimony?
They'll be destroyed.
They'll be destroyed, okay.
So any testimonies that are not at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is a body that, where you can, that will house a lot of the records from the settlement agreement, those records will be destroyed. There's another piece to this that's quite complicated, and that's the records from testimonies about what kinds of abuse took place in what schools, and a lot of those records are also being destroyed because the courts felt that they might identify particular survivors or that they'd be too telling.
Okay. What has surprised you most about your findings?
Oh, that's a big question. Well, I call out to the research associates and, Curtis Shuba and Saidi Deska Gautier that are involved in this, because they are experts in vivo, and the information we've been able to pull out is it's enormous in quantity and rich in quality. So it's not only how many times something gets talked about, but how exactly that issue was framed, by whom. Every speaker that's ever spoken on any issue related to the IAP, so in terms of the media and Hanson analysis, these interviews are they leave me thinking about them for days afterwards, trying to deconstruct what is it that I've heard, what is the story, so I think there's a lot.
And there are several comments in the chat thanking you for the presentation. And another question, do we know how many survivors requested their records, and are the Indigenous communities keeping these records safe?
Oh, okay, I like this question. So the NCTR, the last contact we've had at them, we know there's less than 10. Indigenous communities do not per se have access to the stories. The stories are, because they were done under common law, are individual possession of survivors. But not all survivors have requested their transcripts either. And so this is, this gets into some of the politics and complexities of the IAP, because the IAP wasn't just, when you're dealing with abuse, it wasn't just, priests or nuns abusing the students. It was also student on student abuse. And it also involved, what were called persons of interest, who would later be brought into a hearing with the adjudicator to, verify or indemnify themselves. And so there's, it's very complicated. And so it's also potentially quite divisive in communities. And when people were provided with, you know, in a lot of cases, one of the things that was ignored is people were given up to $10,000 for personal care plans. And this allowed people to get healing in whatever format they had written they wanted to get it from the abuses. This is something that could have got a lot more attention, I think, than it did. And so, you know, it had various levels of effects or impacts, but also, you know, in some cases, people were given large sums of money. So, you know, there's also stories about, you know, if you give, for example, a drug addict $100,000, they OD and they kill themselves. So these are and other cases you give, you know, somebody gets $100,000 compensation and they buy a truck and they give money to their kids, and for the first time in their life, they have, you know, a significant sum of money, or maybe make a down payment on a house. So the results are, you know, none of this was monitored, but it also speaks to the need for policy to take into consideration these kind of monetary compensations and how they can impact people's lives.
A comment from Eileen that My Records, mychoice.ca has information on survivors, options, if people want more information on that aspect, i.e. the sharing of records with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. So My Records, mychoice.ca.
Thanks, Eileen. Maybe I'll just say something else on this. I think that work of you know, actually talking to survivors about records, and I mean, there's many that will never want to share their records and they just want to forget about this whole process, and that's completely understandable. But there are people that will want to share their records and need assistance in being able to understand how that's possible. So, you know, my hope was always that that would be taken up by an Indigenous organization, but there also needs to be resources to do it.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Patricia has a hand up, I think.
Okay, Patricia.
Okay, so
Nope.
maybe I can just also say that we do have an article, a more in-depth article in Canadian Studies Journal coming out about the Hanson Discourse Analysis, and are currently negotiating with a book publisher for a book describing more about the study. So we hope that that will happen soon.
Okay, and another comment. Thanks so much for the work you are doing on this important subject. And thank you for the presentation, Cindy.
Thank you.
And I think those are some great words to wrap up on. There's a few Patricias in the room. So the Patricia with the hand up was Pat Bell. I don't know if she had a question or not, but or if it was a leftover hand up. I'm really pleased to see how many people are here. That's amazing. And thank you so much, Cindy, for that presentation on behalf of everyone here, and for sharing all your expertise in this area, which is so important and so valuable. And thank you so much for that work and for sharing it. For those who got here late, I just want to remind that there's going to be a video of the whole presentation available. Oh, Joanne's waving. We're all waving at each other now. There'll be a video in the alumni section, and I believe Jeff is dropping that link in the chat again. So copy that link and share it with your friends so everyone can see this great presentation. Don't forget to check out the upcoming lectures in this series. There's Dr. Elizabeth Cooper, as I mentioned, coming up on October 19th. and our new President and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Jeff Keshen. So new, I'm not even sure if I'm saying his name right. I think I said Keshane the first time because I'm more familiar with that pronunciation, but Dr. Jeff will be here on November 16th. So we hope to see you back here on October 19th for Elizabeth's presentation. And just thank you so much, everyone, for coming out, and have a great rest of your day.